I'm Carys and Gary.
And I'm Gary Younge.
Every week, Gary and I will be talking about those stories in the news that are being over-reported and the ones that are going completely under the radar and not being talked about enough.
This is Over the Top and Under the Radar. So, Carys, what have you been up to?
Well, sun's out, guns out. It's hot. I'm happy.
Is that a thing?
Guns. I don't know if I actually have guns. I do exercise mostly for mental health reasons, and I have really bad back. But so I don't know if I've got guns, like, big muscles. I do have my arms out.
Okay.
And like you normally, I'm wearing your uniform. I've got shorts on.
But yeah, I'm not wearing shorts.
Mate. Okay, see, there's nothing going on. There's nothing going on.
You knew that.
Your pants are wearing
pants. You know my domestic uniform.
Gary doesn't believe in trousers at home. To be clear, he's in pants. He's not naked. But if you ever knock at Gary's door, he'll probably answer it in like a t-shirt and his boxers. And I respect your right to be comfortable, Gary. It's your home. I
will poke my head around the corner first. It won't be a full frontal unless I know who's coming. But you know what? My house, my rules.
Yeah, I respect that. And again, for context, Gary doesn't make you take your trousers off. He maintains the right to not wear trousers. It's not. And
I do wear them outside the house, so there is that too. Unless I'm putting the rubbish out, I will sometimes just leg it down the steps in my scanties.
You're playing with fire there. That's always what can I wear to take the bins out? Can I wear these?
Just last night, I was like, shit, wearing my pajama trousers. I gotta get, and I just thought, fuck it.
It's hot. No one's gonna mind. So I've got one bit of an update from when we last spoke last week. Mm-hmm. Got a new hobby. It is born out of procrastination. I've got lots of stuff I need to sort out with my life. Instead of doing that stuff, I have started reselling my clothes on a popular clothes reselling app that I'm not going to name because they're not paying us. But if you want to sponsor us, get in touch. Basically, you take a picture of something on your phone, upload it to the website, you put a price, and then someone either buys it or like makes a bid, like it was an auction. Like they're like, you said it was worth 40, I'll give you £37.50. And then you sell it and you get this huge dopamine hit and you feel like I'm an entrepreneur. I'm out here making moves, I'm getting that money, passive income. It's not very passive.
Next thing you know, you're opposed to higher tax brackets because that will be you.
Yeah. Well, next thing I know, I'm just like, yeah, but they're just like taxing the wealth creators. Yeah. It's a slippery slope, Gary. I can see that now. But I'm also I'm really enjoying, having a new hobby, a new weird hobby. And you get a bit of a boost when someone buys like some of your clothes because it's like, yeah, I've got great taste.
Which begs the question why you're giving it away if you've got great taste.
I don't know if others. I feel like you have a more basic. You and I have different approaches to clothes buying. I have a lot of clothes that I have bought and not worn very much, and now they're getting a second lease of life with Sarah, who's one of the people that bought a shirt. So I'm also actually, Gary, I'm sort of saving the world because of climate change and fast fashion and like single-handedly I'm undoing that. I'm part of the circular economy now, Gary. That's me.
The ice caps, thank you for your entrepreneurship.
I
mean, my attitude to clothes is to keep on wearing them until the stubborn understains that are keeping them together finally disintegrate.
I think you know what you like and what you want to wear. So I think it's rare you would buy something and not wear it because you know what your style is. I'm always like, oh, well, maybe I'll become a glamorous lady who needs to wear fancy dresses. I certainly must buy this in the sale and I will surely wear it to many a dinner party. And then, I live my life, basically, bit of a raccoon. I walk around the park. I wear trainers every day and the dress sits there making me feel guilty. Whereas I think you've got your look, you've got your outfits. You're not doing impulse buying, would be my guess.
My thing is like, what goes well with mustard and ketchup? That's what's going to end up on this shirt.
Should we dive into what the listeners have been saying?
Yes. Jonathan on Patreon, he says, I've been enjoying the podcast so much over the past 6 months. Thank you, Jonathan. And besides the obvious point that politics podcasts are shockingly white, you guys play an important role in bringing my center of gravity back to the left. promised myself I would upgrade if I got my promotion. I did, so I am. So 2 things there, Jonathan. First of all, congratulations on your promotion.
Congratulations!
Yeah, way to go. And secondly, thank you so much for sharing some of your well-gotten gains with us.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan, and congrats on the promotion. You can find us all over social media: Blue Sky, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, and even X on @over_under_pod_. So, Gary, on my list today is the local elections and the executive order that Trump didn't pass.
I want to talk about Tony Blair and drinking from skulls. So let's go.
Very intriguing. So my over the top for this week are the local elections. A number of local councils are being re-elected this week, only across England. So there are 23 local authorities where elections are taking place. It's about 1,600 council seats. And as we're recording the podcast, people are going to the polls. When you're listening to the podcast, the polls will have closed. The reason I think the media are going over the top on these elections is I think it's a great example of like the Westminster bubble and how lobby journalists and political journalists are just kind of like this big hype machine that loves drama. They're kind of like, you know, if there's like a fight in the school playground, lobby journalists are the ones who kind of like gather around being like, fight, fight, fight. Or like, ooh, did you hear what he said? Did you hear what he said? So like, just if we're looking at the bare bones of the facts, less than 1% of council seats in the UK are up for election this week. It's about 1,600. There are about 19,000 councillors in the UK. So just like off the bat, it's not a huge section of the country, and it isn't big enough to tell us what people in the UK are thinking. So we're getting a lot of hype and a lot of coverage for a very small number of seats. The second thing is, because we're sort of off cycle now, there is one parliamentary by-election in Runcorn. You can read about why that is. It involves a Labour MP punching someone. And like there are these mayoral elections, but we know that by-elections are not general elections. Turnout is lower. The people who vote are different. And the analogue for this, the last version of these elections, was in 2021. Cast your minds back. Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, the vaccine rollout had begun, and it was a barnstorming success for the Conservatives, broadly speaking. They won lots of council seats, and they won the Hartlepool by-election, which at the time prompted rumours that Keir Starmer was considering resigning. So if we just look back to the last time these elections happened, they were a pretty poor prediction for what the next general election would be. Tories did well, Starmer did badly. Fast forward to 2024, Starmer did well, Tories did badly. So I think there are some interesting things that we should be looking out for in this election. But I think what we're going to get in terms of the coverage is lots of colour-coded charts, lots of hype about reform being on the march, about how well Farage is doing, how many more seats reform has won. They got 2 in the last election. Anything more than 2 is going to be a result. I would really caution people against drawing too much from such a small set of elections happening at such a sort of weird time in terms of our bigger electoral cycle. I do think there are some interesting things for us to pay attention to, but I just was interested in terms of how you're feeling about the elections. Are you paying any attention? And why do journalists, why they get so hyped about everything?
Well, particularly lobby journalists and political journalists who aren't necessarily as a group, obviously there are good individual ones, overburdened with imagination, mistake politics for electoralism. So that's all there is, you know. So the horse race, who's up, who's down, and so on. I do think there are 3 ways in which I think I would want to just further complicate what you say. I take your point. It is a poor indication of who's going to win the next election, and we should get rid of all the horse racy stuff, all of that. First of all, if we look back to when the Brexit Party, previous iteration of reform, did really well in a European election, remember that when we were in Europe? And it was on the basis of that the Tories came up with the hostile environment policy. And it was on the basis of that we had the Windrush scandal. And so while these things are really poor indicators of who's going to win in whenever, 2029, or they do really help set a tone. And, in terms of where Labour thinks it has to look and who it thinks it has to appeal to and who the Tories think they have to appeal to. I'm imagining that most of the stuff, I'm making a guess, but that most of the stuff that will come out of this will be about the rise of reform, but also the kind of collapse of the Tories, maybe, and the collapse of Labour. There might be a spike in the Green vote. There are things that I think you can say, and I know that you weren't saying that you can't tell anything from them, just that we shouldn't go over the top. And then the other thing is the material stuff that happens as a result of councils changing hands. Like, we might actually see reform running a few councils. That's useful because then, well, it's not useful, it's terrible. I don't want it to happen. But if we're going to see that, then first of all, that will have an impact. Farage, for example, has already talked about children being overdiagnosed for the special needs and so on, when in fact, for things like EHCP, education health plans, they have to appeal to get those plans. They are less likely. It's not a case of them being overdiagnosed, but they are certainly being insufficiently provided for. So we could see something like that come into the firing line. Local councils fund some arts institutions. You could see that taking a battering. But also reform may then have to actually run things. Rather than standing on the sideline and saying, Yabu sucks and you're all terrible, we'll actually see them in action. And my guess, if we look at Trump, if we look at where the extreme right do run things, they're really shit at running things. They're really bad.
I think you're right. And I think the thing that I really think doesn't matter is the charts that we're going to get with gains and losses, not because local councils don't have a huge amount of power and aren't going to impact people's lives, but because the number of seats is so small and the timing we're at in terms of when the next general election will likely be is far enough away that a lot can and will change in politics. But I think you have hit on two things that really do matter and that we should be paying attention to. First is the fact that so much of politics is perception and not reality, or that in politics, perception sort of is the reality. So even if it's a small number of seats, if the thing that the Westminster lobby are writing about is Keir Starmer's on the back foot, the Labour government are unpopular, Farage could be the next prime minister, then that kind of becomes the mood music, right? And it does probably mean that given what we've seen from this Labour government, you'll get even like harsher kind of tilt to the right, even more reform-like policies, which I don't believe is the way to beat reform. It could potentially turbocharge something we're already seeing from the Labour government. So it will matter in terms of what the vibe is in Westminster and how beleaguered the Labour government feels. I think the other thing that is important, I don't know why I do these things to myself, but I watched the 2-hour-long launch rally that Reform held for their local elections campaign in Birmingham a month ago.
Do you do this so that we won't have to? Is this a service?
Yeah, I do it so that you don't have to, listeners. And I just, sidebar, I did not know that Newsrounds, he's not on Newsround anymore, I think Dr. David Bull was part of Reform. Very disappointing. He was the hype man. I was like, David, what happened? The thing I think really does matter about this local election, there's the machinery of how parties win elections. And it is less written about, but it is so important. So like the Lib Dems have a party infrastructure and a machinery and the ability to stand anywhere. And what Reform is building now by contesting more seats than they did in the last election is an electoral machine, and it's testing it. And Farage is very explicit about this in the Birmingham rally. It's a speech to activists. And he is, number one, telling a very coherent story about reform and what it has to do. But he is also saying to his base, this is the first run. Next year, Wales, then Scotland, and then the general. And what Reform are doing that we do need to be scared of is building the capacity and the electoral machine to contest more seats and to sort of build up the muscle that can help them win in Parliament. So I think the mechanics of what is happening for the small parties behind the scenes are important. And I think that the bit we need to worry about is that Reform are skilling up and building up the infrastructure to be able to contest the general election in a real way. And in a sense, that work can happen and the winning seats is less important. I do think it will be instructive to see what happens if there are some reform-run councils. Again, they have a very clear narrative. They have a very clear plan. Nigel Farage came out on a JCB talking about potholes, which, I care about, Gary. So yeah, I think they've also got a very compelling narrative because local authorities are in crisis. So many of them are bust. And that sense of what have we got to lose? The seeds are being sown for the next election, but the things we need to focus on are not just vote counts and, the colourful charts.
My over the top is Tony Blair. He's called for a major rethink of net zero policies, arguing that the limiting energy consumption and fossil fuel production is doomed to fail. Net zero is where whatever you're producing in terms of carbon emissions, you are also kind of compensating for elsewhere. He says voters feel that they're being asked to make financial sacrifices and changes in lifestyle when they know the impact on global emissions is minimal. He since rode back on that a little bit. He said it yesterday morning, then he kind of came in a bit because Labour, interestingly, the Labour establishment kind of pushed back on him. He says the public have lost faith in climate policies because the green jobs haven't come. And his institute, Tony Blair's institute, is arguing, this is where the report comes from, that global institutions like COP and the UN haven't made sufficient progress in this. So here's my view about that. The first is that I have heard enough from Tony Blair. I heard enough from Tony Blair maybe 15, 20 years ago. And I don't want to hear from him anymore. And I know that some of this is me being stuck. But when I see him on the television, I think, and sometimes say, fucking murderer. That's what I think. You're a fucking murderer. You are responsible for large numbers of people dying unnecessarily. Everybody told you, or many people told you, that this was a bad idea. You went ahead and did it. You fucking lied to us. Lots of people are dead. That region is still unstable because of what you did. I don't want to hear any more from you about climate change than I want to hear from fucking Pol Pot about kind of maternity leave, or Netanyahu if he's got a good policy on labor law. You're a murderer. What you said and what you advocated failed horribly. Large numbers of people died. That's you. Sit down and shut up. I'm done. I don't want to hear what you've got to say. And people who were like, well, he won 3 elections. Yes, he did. And he murdered people. It's like Myra Hindley might have been nice to Pez. It's not like nothing good happened under his rule. But there's a really big thing that happened. He actually staked his reputation on it. And it was really bad. So I don't want to hear from him. Secondly, his institute, one of the biggest sources of cash in that institute, comes from a guy called Larry Ellison, the billionaire founder of Oracle, ally of US President Donald Trump. He's an advisor to Azerbaijan, Saudi Arabia. He was an advisor to Uzbekistan, which has an absolutely appalling human rights record. He is taking a lot of money from people who provide fossil fuels and then telling us why limiting the use of fossil fuels isn't very useful. So once again, not so much. And then the facts of what he's saying are actually kind of not really there. The truth is that a majority of people in Britain who support every political party and none believe that climate change is real, humans are responsible for it, and don't think that the issue of climate change is exaggerated. It's a majority of people. There is some skepticism, there is, about the effectiveness of government policies. I think that's important. The fact is that green jobs are actually really growing. If you look at ads for green jobs are growing compared to other jobs. And essentially what he's saying is, you know what? Saving the planet doesn't focus group well. We're going to ditch the planet for now and work on the focus groups. So that's my over the top. I don't want to hear from you. Your institution actually is undermined by where it gets its money from. And if that weren't enough, you're actually wrong on the facts.
It's a great over the top. I'm glad that you brought it to the table. I also just want to sidebar that I feel like ever since Tony Blair left office, I think not very secretly, like against his will, was ousted by Brownites, he's done a lot of these rare interventions in British politics. And I feel like at this point, just small note to journalists, please stop calling them a rare intervention in British politics. He's constantly making pronouncements and like weighing in on stuff that no one has asked him about. And yeah, this was the latest one. I'm at the stage of just eye roll. We've talked before about the sort of Tony Benn notion of politicians who are signposts and weather vanes. And the signpost says, this is the way to go, this is what's right. And a weather vane kind of blows with the winds of public opinion. Tony Benn's thesis was always that Blair was a weather vane. And I think that, I think this is a great example of it. It's a hugely harmful intervention. And also one other thing, which is a pet peeve, he does the techno solution thing. Carbon capture and storage, the idea we can just capture the carbon and like put it in the earth and everything will be fine, has been an emergent technology for as long as I've been in the workplace. So for about 20 years, no one is saying technology won't be part of the solution to climate change. But just because it's hard, what we need to do for the planet to remain habitable, a solution and like leadership does not look like being like, well, it's hard and unpopular. So like, let's just say we don't have to do it. Hey, I think the thing that he said that we do need to pay attention to is how toxic the term net zero has become. My fix would not be, let's not worry about it. But there has been a concerted effort, undoubtedly funded by fossil fuel companies, and really another of the many drums that people like Nigel Farage beat to really toxify net zero, toxify green policies, and make people feel like they are like coming for their jobs, one of the reasons that they don't have enough money and aren't living their best lives. So like there's a grain of something interesting in what he said, but everything around what he said is like wrong and problematic and harmful, and journalists should not just be reporting it.
I think that, I think that media organizations have a responsibility to kind of, is that big news? The person, there's been, since he left, there's been Gordon Brown, Ed Miliband, Jeremy Corbyn, and now Keir Starmer. So, going back from him, that would be like John Smith, Neil Kinnock, Michael Foot, and then James Callaghan. I mean, it would be like, when he's in power, we're talking about James Callaghan. He was elected and he got Labour elected 3 times. It's not irrelevant. He was in power for a long time. But actually, what does he represent? He literally is representing countries that make fossil fuels and people with a shitload of money. He's not representing Britain. He's not representing Labour. If you look at the people who he coaches up to, like he offered his advice to the Murdoch people who are on trial over phone hacking, he's not our friend. And there is one other thing, which is that to the extent that people have lost faith in some of these policies, it is partly because at the first sign of gunshot, politicians come and run away. So with ULEZ, the ultra-low emission zone in London, which people who had certain cars or non-compliant vehicles had to pay money to drive in certain areas of London. It's a flat tax. That's a problem. It came in a moment of significant pain. That is also a problem. It was a feature in the Uxbridge by-election. I would question how big a feature it was. As soon as it became a feature, Keir Starmer was like, yeah, you know what, that Sadiq Khan, it better ditch that. That's a really unpopular policy. Now we have some facts which show that as a result of ULEZ, the levels of nitrogen oxide coming out of cars, which drives asthma and lung cancer, are 15% lower across the 3 boroughs that were most resistant to it.
And that's the common arc, that it's like it comes in, people are a bit like, what's all of this? But it's actually popular and it delivers better outcomes. I believe in leadership. I believe lots of people can be leaders. And like one of the things real leadership is not telling people what they want to hear to make yourself popular in the short term. Former prime ministers, presidents, political leaders are unshackled from needing to get re-elected. So they should use their platform to say the tough stuff that maybe they didn't say when they were in office, not to like shill for oil companies.
A big shout out to the people who joined us on Patreon recently: Andrea, Madeline, Jonathan, and Anna. Really, really grateful for your support. We have 492 Patreon subscribers, of whom 451 are fully fledged paying Patreon members. So thank you. The team and I that make this podcast, we make it because we believe that there's an audience out there of people just like us, like you, who are being failed by the so-called mainstream media. And that audience consists of people comfortable with unashamedly progressive perspectives, but also with a sense of humor and a sense of irony.
Us and the small Black-owned production company behind the podcast are a pretty small team, and we are not all paid for what we do. Because our values matter to us, we don't want to take random adverts, and we only accept sponsorship and support from organisations whose values align with ours. So really, it's your contributions that keep the podcast alive and help us to keep going.
So if you enjoy the pod and find value in what we do, please consider donating. The packages start at just £5 plus VAT a month. And if you're ready to donate, please consider upgrading your membership.
If you support us on Patreon, you get the podcast episode and a bonus episode. You get our weekly newsletter and you get access to the exclusive over under WhatsApp community. And it really is a community. They have their own Spotify playlist that is ever growing. So everyone joins and adds some of their favorite songs to it. I think we might be able to share that. Maybe we can let people check it out. The thing that's really inspired me and is one of the reasons that I love doing this podcast with you, Gary, is just, how much of a community of people there are and, how they've sort of found one another as well as enjoying listening to the episodes.
So search Over the Top, Under the Radar on Patreon and put your money where your ears are.
Patreon subscribers also get told first about any podcast news. They were the first people to know that we are doing another live show. It is at the Podcast Show Live. It is on the 20th of May. And there is more information in our newsletter and online at thepodcastshowlondon.com. So my under the radar is Trump related. I want to talk about an executive order that didn't get passed, but might still get passed, that I think we need to pay attention to. So, bit of context, executive orders, for those who aren't US political obsessives, are a way that the president can make policy, set rules, change things without having to go through Congress. So you can issue an executive order about something as president and it gets done, generally speaking. Trump uses executive orders a lot, and there were leaks from the Trump camp around the time of Easter that he was planning an executive order that would remove the non-profit status of a set of organizations. So basically tax exemption. And that he was considering an executive order that would basically ban non-profits from, among other things, issuing grants beyond US borders. So there's a category of organization that this is really in the weeds, but stay with me, called 501c3s. That's basically the equivalent of a UK charity. Non-profits that aren't trying to win elections, are trying to do good work, get tax breaks. And I think aside from the fact that this would block a ton of philanthropy, so, I don't know, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Open Societies Foundation, which is the Soros Foundation, that give out lots and lots of money around the world. It also was rumored to be targeting climate change organizations, so organizations working on the environment. So the order hasn't been passed, but the fact it was trailed and the fact I've spoken to some people in nonprofits, people were, do we need to move this money out of the US now because we won't be able to move it again, in that sort of level of panic and planning. And I wanted to talk about it because I think there are a couple of things that we need to be aware of. And it's always hard with the Trump stuff to be what is the most important? What is the most urgent? The thing that I think is always remarkable and impressive about the right and this incarnation of the right is how clearly they have identified the people that are their enemies and the people that are in any way supporting progressive sentiment. And blocking American nonprofits from doing work abroad is effectively blocking solidarity, which is such a key part of left-wing and progressive politics. So I think it's just the forensic focus they have on any organizations that support people that might not support them. It's just doubling down on what happened with all the US aid cuts, and in real terms could mean that a lot of organizations that do really important work don't have money. But I think the other thing I want to draw attention to is the chilling effect that even the rumor of this has had. So especially among climate groups who are rumored to be targeted. There's one grassroots nonprofit in Alabama that said that they've sanitized their website ahead of the suspected executive order to remove phrases like climate resilience that could trigger additional scrutiny from the administration. And they've emphasized partnerships with environmental groups in Republican strongholds because they think it will mean that they are less likely to be targeted. So the threat of the thing has already changed how people are behaving. It's sinister, but I think it's also, again, worth paying attention to just like how clear the right are about who their enemies are and how ruthless they are about trying to eliminate them and blocking funding and resources. Let's be blunt. We already have less money than them because they've got most of the billionaires. So yeah, it went under the radar, and I get why it hasn't been passed, but it's already had an impact. And it's one of those things that in 3 to 5 years' time, we could be looking at the state of progressive movements and being like, this really undermined or killed them.
I mean, there is this kind of scary panopticon effect that this moment has where people start not saying things online or removing things from their websites in order to not find themselves in sight, which is disabling. I remember at a certain point when Corbyn started talking about nuclear disarmament and thinking, oh yeah, what happened to that? Because we just stopped talking about it, didn't we? We just stopped talking about it as it just became sort of something really impossible. I think there was also something, so just building on what you were saying in a sense and moving towards a future, about wondering whether those arrangements like 501c3, where we get our money from, or arts organisations who get their money from the Arts Council, and then when the Arts Council says, oh, you can't do that or you can't do this, just thinking, while we like this money, is this the best model for what we want to do? And that, in a way, he's highlighting some of the fault lines in that, really. Where federal funding, where US federal funding to a lot of kind of aid things, for example, it's like, it's good that those things are being funded. I think it's a reasonable question to ask also, how dependent do we want to be on this country, on this state? And he's really high, or on this form of organization, a charitable model, which means we can't say the more political things. The last thing I'd say about that is also the way in which he picks these targets, and that we on the left have to be very careful then about whatever issues I have with DEI, and I have lots of issues with DEI, the moment it becomes part of Trump's target, then I have to understand that strategically differently. It's amazing how many people you're seeing not do that. An example of that for me, we talked about it a bit last week, would be trans issues. It's like, well, hang on. For a while you were talking about feminism and all of that, and this was your route into saying that trans people shouldn't have these rights or those rights or shouldn't be able to use this or that or the other. Now they're in the crosshairs of the Trump administration, reform and so on. Are you going to carry on saying the same thing? Are you going to adjust that strategically at all? Or are you just going to be like, yeah, just like my guy just said, yeah, it should recalibrate our kind of strategic priorities, I think.
I don't feel like philanthropy is this uncomplicated, amazing thing, and that all of these organizations that are at risk of losing money or getting slapped with huge tax bills, all the work they do is great and amazing. Like, there's lots of really great stuff we can link to in the newsletter about some of the challenges with philanthropic models. But I think it's the ruthlessness with which the right are able to say, these are the things and people and causes that threaten us, and we are going to starve them. We're going to starve them of like money and oxygen, of public funding. We're not going to let them have tax breaks. And it's like, we're going to scorch the earth and then we're going to salt the earth so that nothing can grow. And so I think we do need to be worried about that, and about this, the fear of coming under attack will make people less brave or less radical, when that, I truly believe, is the solution, that you need to have an answer that is radical and coherent and not to sort of be cowed by this. But, I can also see it's really tough. I've worked for lots of small nonprofits. They're always struggling to make ends meet and pay everyone. So I also get that it's really hard if, your funding isn't secure and it's under threat. But so one to pay attention to. Maybe it will get passed. Maybe it will get junked. It's hard to know with this gang.
Under the radar for me is the story of how for several decades at Worcester College, Oxford, at formal dinners, people used to drink from human skulls.
What?
Or from a human skull.
What now?
Yes, exactly. Oxford academics drinking from a chalice made from a human skull.
I have so many questions. I assume you're going to explain this more.
And when the skull eventually kind of degraded enough that some of the wine was leaking out of it, they changed it so that you could serve chocolates in it. And this was a revelation from a guy called Dan Hicks, Professor Dan Hicks, impressive guy. I've met him for a radio show I did with the BBC. Professor Dan Hicks is curator of world archaeology at the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. And he's got a book coming out called Every Monument Will Fall. So, we get a sense of where Professor Dan Hicks is coming from. And he's worked hard on issues of restitution, giving stuff back, all of that. We don't know who the skull belonged to, but some research suggests it's about 225 years old, and circumstantial evidence suggests it came from the Caribbean and probably belonged to an enslaved woman, he thinks. It was donated to Worcester College in 1946 by a former student, George Pitt Rivers, whose name is inscribed on the silver rim which is attached to the skull. Pitt Rivers was a eugenicist. He was interned by the British government during the Second World War because of his support for Oswald Mosley. So he sounds like a nice chap. That's where the skull came from. And they used it. They fancied it up and they used it as tableware. It was 2015 when they stopped using a human skull in Oxford to either drink wine or passed around what I assume is after dinner mints, but chocolates. So there's a few things I want to say about that. The first is, what the actual fuck? I mean, Jesus Christ. That's not my most eloquent response to an under the radar, but I think this one qualifies. I can't help thinking of Gandhi when he was asked, what does he think of Western civilization? And he said, I think it would be a good idea. These are not necessarily literally the same people, but this is Oxford. This produces a leadership class that at other times will talk about us, black people or Muslims or both, not being ready for prime time, not being up for kind of enlightenment. These are the people who think that they can talk to us about civilization, drinking fucking wine from a human skull. So there's that. The second thing that I think is important to move from there to the issue of restitution and just the amount of stuff that they stole stuff. There's no question of the plunder that we willingly, openly, proudly display in our museums. There was no basis for keeping this. David Cameron said, if you do it for one, you've got to do it for all, and then it'll never stop, and the British Museum will be empty. And the first lie about that is that 99% of the British Museum stuff is in storage, so it'll be fine. Secondly, you should do it for all. If you stole it from everyone, you should give it back. It's like somebody being caught having stolen like all the tellies in a kind of street and going, well, if I give one person their telly back, I'm going to give everybody their telly back. And then I won't have like 400 tellies. It's like, yeah, but they're not your tellies. Give them back. They make out like, but if we give them back, then, those people can't look after it. There was a question of stuff from the British Museum that was being sold on eBay. Bloody eBay. Stuff that they stole, they can't even look after it properly.
Wait, they've got their own little account. They're doing what? They're getting dopamine here.
Exactly. And then finally, this isn't the only skull that was kicking around. Field Marshal Lord Grenfell, he from whom the tower was named, he dug up the skull of a Zulu commander 2 years after he was killed by the British Army in 1879 and took it as loot. And then in Spain, there was an exhibit in a museum called El Negro. So guess what part of the world he was from? Who was literally stuffed, a human body stuffed by a taxidermist and put in a park, who they only removed in 1997. So they got previous. The Belgians only returned Patrice Lumumba's tooth a few years ago that they'd kept. It's not enough that they murdered the guy. They wouldn't give his family his tooth back. I mean, that wasn't in a museum, but still.
Doesn't that skull have loads of holes? Like, how are you even drinking from it? Like the eyes and the nose, it just feels logistically very odd to me. This isn't like a natural vessel. This wasn't like in extremis. Like, this is not a natural cup. Someone went out of their way to make it a cup, which connects to my second point, which is For those of you that watch the Netflix show You, which is wildly ridiculous and is about a sort of sociopathic, psychopathic man, one of the things he does, and a lot of, TV serial killers do, is he collects trophies from the people he's killed or the people he's stalking. And like, that's what this is giving to me. It's like weird, like keeping the tooth, keeping the skull. It's like these weird trophies. And at a time when on this side of the pond, it's Farage or it's Trump or it's whoever, we're being told that there's something wrong with talking about our colonial history or wanting to be honest about the things that the British Empire did. Yeah, it feels like quite a strong visual metaphor for something that we do actually need to spend a little time on and unpack. Because, like the trophy keeper, it's very strange.
One of the interesting things, I've been reading a bit about this recently, about museums and stuff, is that a lot of this looting was actually condemned at the time. There is a weird thing of people like say, well, you have to understand these things in their time. And first of all, that always sounds to me like, yeah, but that's before racism was bad, or that's before sexism was bad. But also, it suggests always that at the time, people weren't doing anything about it. And they almost always were. And I can't think of any time when drinking from a skull was like, okay. I do like the Worcester College spokesperson in this piece, in The Guardian. And they do say Dr. Hicks acknowledges apparently in his book that the college dealt with the issue ethically and thoughtfully, which is a bit like when people insist Britain abolish slavery. And it's like, yeah, well, if you didn't do it, you wouldn't have to abolish it. That's like, yeah, but I stopped stealing televisions. But they say, college spokesperson said, in the 20th century, the vessel was sometimes on display with the college's silver collection and used as tableware.
Spare a thought for the person whose job it was to write that statement.
I know. And it's kind of like...
Just started my new job as a press officer at an Oxford college. Yeah. Let's check my inbox.
And I think it matters that it happened at Oxford. I think that it matters that it was within the practice of the British ruling class to drink wine from a human skull this century. Says a lot.
This century. Well, last century, but yeah.
No, 2015. They were doing it until 2015.
Oh, wow. Okay. Wow. No, oh, yeah. Wow. Century. That's,
I mean, like...
very much this century. Yeah. I'm not going to lie to you, Gary, just to bring a bit of sunlight into magic. Gary and I decide what order we're going to do our stories. When you said drinking from skulls, I thought it was going to be like a social media trend that would be quite funny. And it is very much quite a heavy thing about colonialism. Yeah, still an important one to hear about. But I'm sort of struggling how to land this one now, because I thought it was going to be like teenagers would just like...
I think it's so mental. Obviously, I'm aware of how it's become. But when I saw that in Spain, they had stuffed a human being in human skin and put it in a park, and that when they went to remove it in 1997, local people were like, oh, but El Negro, he's part of our community. Like, no, he's not. He's dead and he's been stuffed. There is something so crazy about it that I'm kind of both appalled and sort of laughing all at the same time. I kind of can't. I know it's not like, and finally, here's a duck that goes on a skateboard. But it is just like...
Yeah. Which, my bad for not Googling it.
But it is like, you did what? What did you do?
From a skull? Also, you had to go out your way to make the skull drinkable. That's what's weird about it. Whose job was that? Turn it into a vessel.
I think the bit at which it's like, oh, the skull's leaking. What will we do? That they have another chance, right? They have another chance. Oh, it's tradition, and I didn't really think about it. And they're like, well, we could put chocolates in it. It's like, yeah.
Chocolates.
Stellar.
They're solid. Yeah. Okay, well, on that very weird note, I guess that's our episode. Thank you for listening to Over the Top, Under the Radar.
Remember to like, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to support the show, find us by searching Over the Top, Under the Radar on Patreon.
You can sign up to our newsletter at overunderpod.com, and you can connect with us on social media at over_under_pod_.
And we're going to be at the podcast show live on May the 20th, and we'd love you to join us. More info in our newsletter or online at thepodcastshowlondon.com.